Hi, everyone. Thank you for watching our webinar on Alberta's nonprofit legal landscape. My name is Phil, and I'm a Community Development Officer in the Community Development Unit with Alberta Culture, Multiculturalism, and Status of Women. The Community Development Unit provides supports to nonprofit and public sector organizations in the areas of board governance, strategic planning, organizational development, and consultation and training. This webinar today is divided into two parts. In the first part, I discussed the legal landscape that affects all nonprofits in Alberta. I'll also explain a model that shows the relationships between the legal documents that all nonprofits ought to have. In part two, one of my colleagues from the Community Development Unit will share some lessons about Alberta's nonprofit legal landscape from her work in the field. Ultimately, at the end of the webinar, we hope that you walk away with an understanding of the legal obligations that nonprofits must comply with in Alberta, as well as be able to describe the relationship between specific legal documents for incorporated nonprofit organizations. The type of nonprofit organization determines many of the laws and regulations that apply to it. It also affects the responsibilities and liabilities of their board members. Many of the nonprofits in Alberta are incorporated organizations, and this means that they've gone through the process of incorporation. This is the process by which an organization gets formal legal status. Once an organization is incorporated, they are considered a legal person, and that organization has almost the same status in law as a human being. This means that the organization can buy, sell, and own property, it can enter into contracts, it's responsible for its own debts, and it can sue others and be sued in return. The nonprofit, therefore, is a separate entity that is independent from the board of directors, the officers or employees, or the members of the corporation. Now, this differs from unincorporated associations who have no separate legal identity. Unlike incorporated organizations, unincorporated associations have no specific legislation that governs their affairs. That's not to say that they don't have to follow laws, though. They still have to follow federal and provincial laws like employment standards, tax laws, occupational health and safety laws, and human rights legislation, to name a few. But let's steer this conversation back to incorporated organizations. As I mentioned earlier, nonprofits operate within a framework of laws that govern what they can do and how they must do it. There are external rules, and these are things like various pieces of legislation and regulations. The main piece of legislation being the one that the organization is incorporated under. The piece of legislation that a majority of nonprofits in Alberta are incorporated under is called the Societies Act. These external rules are made by governments and public officials that everyone must follow. There are also internal rules, things like the organization's objects, bylaws, policies, procedures, and to a lesser extent, their customs. Unsurprisingly, these internal rules are made by the organization itself, and therefore the organization must follow them. Together, the external rules and the internal rules give your organization the authority to do what it does. If your organization does not follow its own rules, any decision or action it takes may be invalid, and in some cases may lead to lawsuits and damage claims against the board members. This graphic shows the documents that I previously discussed briefly in the last slide. We call this the ladder of authority. The ladder of authority shows the documents that form the legal framework of incorporated nonprofit organizations under the Alberta Societies Act, who has the authority for each document and the relationship between them. The more familiar you are with these legal documents, the more you will understand what rules your organization has and how your organization should get its work done. You want to actively use these documents. You want to refer to them when decision-making, review them regularly, and update them if necessary. Before I move on, let's take a moment to give an example of each of these types of documents. Right at the very top, under legislation, the Societies Act is the most common piece of legislation that nonprofits incorporate under in Alberta. The next step on the ladder are the regulations, and there are a number of regulations found within the Societies Act that nonprofits must follow. These regulations inform nonprofits how to carry out that legislation. Further down, there are objects. And objects is a particular term that corporate registry uses, and they are short statements that describe the purpose of the organization and why it exists. The next document are the bylaws. Bylaws are a set of general rules that outline how the board governs the organization. Bylaws tend to not be too specific and should be rules that the organization doesn't want easily changed on the whim of a member. The next step down are policies. While bylaws are a general set of rules, policies are more specific rules that guide the actions of the board, committees, staff, and volunteers. For example, a bylaw might state that to be part of an organization, there is a membership fee. The policies would be more specific and would declare how much that membership costs, for instance. The last document is procedures. Procedures detail how to carry out the policy, similar to how regulations provide details of how to carry out legislation. Going back to the previous example about membership fees, the policy around that might detail how that money is collected, let's say via credit card or PayPal only, for example. Now let's take a moment to go over the ladder starting at the top. In each section of the ladder, the name of the document is shown on the top of the rung, while the group that has authority for that document is displayed below. Now, when I say authority, I am referring to the group that can change, modify, or is accountable to that document. As we look at the entire ladder of authority, it is important to note that the information found in a document on a lower level cannot oppose any document above it. For example, an organization's policies cannot contain rules that don't align with or that actively oppose what your bylaws allow you to do. Now, let's use a more concrete example. Let's say that there is a golf club society incorporated under the Alberta Societies Act, and that organization creates a new bylaw stating that membership within the golf club will result in the distribution of shares to members. This would actually contradict a section of the Societies Act that states, no society shall have capital divided into shares, or declare any dividend, or distribute its property amongst its members during the existence of the society. In this case, a bylaw or policy is going against what is allowed even further up on the ladder, not just the rung directly above it. Ultimately, what I want to stress to you is the importance of being familiar with each of these legal documents. You don't need to be experts on them, but it is important to know them, use them, refer to them when making decisions, to review them regularly, and to update them when necessary. And that takes us to the end of this section of the webinar. In the next section, I will be talking with Jen, another community development officer, and she will be sharing some wisdom that she has gained from her work in the field. Hi, Jen. Thanks for joining us today.
Hello.
Before we begin, could you please give a brief introduction of who you are and what you do with the Community Development Unit as a Community Development Officer?
Sure. So I've been with the Community Development Unit for a little over 8 years now, and I spend, I would say most of my time, but that would be a lie, all of my time, working with nonprofit and public organizations, looking at a variety of things, but especially organizational development and organizational functioning. So that can involve skill development with nonprofit organizations or public bodies around governance and team development, running effective meetings, different operational pieces. It can also include a lot of facilitation of challenging or difficult conversations, sometimes complex or messy conversations. And it also looks like designing and helping with public engagement. So how do we hear from and really understand the needs of the people we are trying to serve and be informed by that while we're making decisions and assessing our organization and our programs?
Great. Well, thank you for joining us today. I think you have a wealth of knowledge that you're going to be able to pass on today.
We'll see.
So thank you. So previously in this webinar, I briefly discussed the concept of incorporation for nonprofit organizations. And I am curious, in your experience, what are some reasons or potential advantages why a nonprofit might want to incorporate?
Sure. So I think there's several advantages to incorporating. I don't know that it's always the advantages that are the reasons people incorporate. So I think one of the biggest advantages to incorporating is that you create a legal person, you create a legal status. So when you incorporate an organization, the organization can enter into contracts. The organization can buy or sell or manage property. There's an entity that can engage in these activities. And if you're not incorporated, of course, then you don't have a separate entity to do that. One of the people involved has to take that responsibility. I think further advantage to that is that limited liability. Then if you incorporate an organization, the organization can enter into the contract. The organization is then responsible for the contract. The organization can be sued or not sued or enter into these agreements with other people. If you're not incorporated and you want to do these things, then it's the individual themselves. So it would be me signing a contract and me being responsible for that contract, and therefore the liability, the risk, the responsibility falls on me as an individual instead of the organization as an entity. So there's several advantages. There's several advantages to incorporating. I think based on conversations I've had with nonprofits, the primary reason people choose to incorporate is to get access to grant funding. So a lot of funding organizations have in their eligibility criteria that organizations have to be incorporated in order to apply for the money that they have available. And that's probably the primary reason people give for wanting to incorporate.
Perfect. Thank you for that. And I'm just going to pivot from incorporation now. I want to move on to discussing the framework that all nonprofits have to work within, that is the legal framework. Why would you say it's important for board members to have a good understanding of the external and internal rules that they have to follow?
Well, one, if you don't understand them, they're really hard to follow. So, I mean, maybe you end up following them by chance, but if you're not aware the rules exist, or if you're aware the rules exist, but you don't know what they mean or anything like that, then it's very, very hard to actually follow the rules. And of course, if you don't follow the rules, you can get in trouble. It maybe doesn't happen all that often, but you can get in trouble if you don't follow the rules. And some rules, you know, like criminal code, you are very likely to get in trouble if you're not following that. Apart from you have to actually know the rules to be able to follow them, I think the rules are important for a couple of reasons. One is they set clear boundaries on what you can and can't do and how you should or shouldn't do things. So if your legal framework internally says we do these things but not these things, then you have some clear direction. You know where you should be playing and the sandbox you should be in and what you should be working on and what you shouldn't be, what you should leave alone and leave to someone else. And that means it actually saves some decision-making time, right? So instead of debating, well, which one of these things we should do, our rules clearly say that we don't do this, we do this. Then there's really no need to talk about it and have a debate about it, right? The decision is made for you. So it actually saves some decision-making time and effort. I would also say that some of the rules can and should make some of the ethical pieces easier. So instead of trying to figure out what is a respectful or responsible or ethical way to handle the situation or to deal with this problem, your rules can set out guidelines for how you do that in an ethical and responsible way. And so if you follow them, it saves you some of the concern, it saves you some of the stumbling, and it saves you some of the difficulty of trying to wade through something that can be really muddy and messy.
Yeah. Okay, so following that, speaking of rules, if an organization were to run into a situation where their bylaws, their policies, or their procedures don't give them direction on how to proceed, what can they do about that?
Well, I would say there's probably kind of two steps to start. One is look at the external legal rules. So just because, for instance, your policies or your bylaws don't clearly articulate, say, how to deal with a staff person or a volunteer in a specific situation, there may actually be rules in employment legislation or human rights legislation that does actually lay it out. And so then you still have to follow those rules, right? So if you don't have anything in your internal rules, your internal bylaws or policies, first start with the external rules and see if there's anything there you have to follow. And then basically you have to figure it out, but you need to document the process and your decision really, really well. So if something happens and you don't have a set rule to follow, make sure you document clearly the things you talk about, the pros and cons you weigh, the trade-offs you consider, the information you gather, and then clearly document the decision you make. That allows you the ability to demonstrate your due diligence, that we really did think about this. We made every effort to make a very responsible decision. And here's the documentation proof of that. It also, probably in that, you have the content for a policy or bylaw so that you don't have to worry about not having an internal rule in the future.
So, and speaking about bylaws and policies and procedures, then it's really important that those specific things are approved and changed by very specific people within the organization or outside the organization in the case of external rules. We had gone over this in the webinar that I just previously presented, but can you just confirm who can approve changes to a nonprofit's objects, bylaws, and policies?
Sure. So nonprofit objects have to go through your membership. They are the overall purpose of your organization. And so the members of your organization are the ones who make the final decision on that. Of course, probably the directors on your board are members of your organization. I don't know what everyone's bylaws say. Maybe they can have directors who are not members, but they're probably members. So they'll get a vote like everyone else, but general membership approves the overall direction and general purpose of the organization. Bylaws also go to membership. They're generally the how you carry out your business in order to achieve that purpose. And so your membership also approves those things. Policies are internal, and so the board of directors actually can approve those themselves and make those changes themselves. They very likely may seek input from staff or volunteers or members of the organization. They may look for best practices elsewhere to inform their decision making, but the board can make those decisions and pass those policies themselves.
And I think one important distinction that you mentioned to me when I was a younger CDO is that although members can approve the changes to the bylaws or approve new bylaws, these changes and new bylaws have to be sent to corporate registry and have to be, they go through another approval process, so to speak. And until that second approval process is done by corporate registry, their old bylaws are still in effect.
Exactly. So your bylaws need to have a stamp on them. And if they don't have a stamp with a date that says registries approved, they are not your real bylaws. Registries checks your bylaws to make sure that they fit within the regulations of the act you are incorporated under. Because of course, you can't set rules in your bylaws that say we're allowed to do this if the regulations set by government say, no, you're not. So they check for those kinds of things for you and make sure that you've covered kind of all the important bases in your bylaws. And it's only when they are stamped as approved and returned to you, and they will be returned with the stamp, that those new bylaws take effect. Until then, you still have to, even if membership has approved any bylaw changes, you still have to run according to your old bylaws. And if you don't, if you run according to the new bylaws that are not yet approved, someone could come in and say, you're not following your own rules. All of the decisions you've been making are now null and void.
Wow. So there's a big consequence of not having that particular distinction with that second approval process when changing bylaws or making new bylaws.
The changes may be minor. I don't know. You may want to change a board term from 2 years to 3 years. They may be fairly major. They may be around who has voting rights within your membership, or how many terms a board member can serve on the board, or what's considered a majority passing vote and what is not. The challenge comes in, not that this happens very often, but I have actually had very difficult conversations with at least 2 organizations in my time as a community development officer, where they've said, well, what do? We worked really hard, we made these decisions, and someone came to us and said, all the decisions are undone, you didn't follow your own rules. And I said, well, but they can do that because you weren't following your own rules. because you were following bylaws your members said looked great, but you never got them filed with registries. And so they're not technically your rules yet. And so you could run into some fairly significant organizational and operational challenges, as well as legal challenges, if you're either not following your rules or following the wrong set of rules.
Right. So then a best practice would be when these discussions about changing bylaws come up or creating new bylaws, that it's really clearly communicated to the membership that these new bylaws don't come into effect until we get that stamp of approval from corporate registry.
Exactly. And the other thing I've suggested to a couple of nonprofits is that the motion to pass the bylaws include in it some wording around the fact that if any changes required by registries are minor and don't change the meaning or the intent of the bylaws, the board can make those alterations on their own without having to go back to membership. Because if you have to go back to membership, then you need to follow your special general meeting rules, which probably call for at least 3 weeks notice of the meeting, some notice given of changes to bylaws so that they can be prepared for the conversation. Then you need to meet your own rules about minimum attendance and majority votes and all of those kinds of things, which can be really difficult depending on the rules you've set for yourself. But if you in the vote to pass the bylaws say, and if it's a tiny change, we trust the board to do it, you don't have to go through that whole process again because you missed an and or something.
That's a great tip to share with our viewers. I want to touch upon this distinction between bylaws and objects as well, because I think sometimes when we are out presenting in the community that this is a distinction that is not necessarily quite apparent. So could you go over how objects differ from bylaws in any way?
Sure, yeah. So they actually differ in some fundamental ways. I think one of the confusing pieces is that objects used to be included in bylaws, and so people didn't realize there was a distinction. And you could basically choose from a checkbox, oh, these sound like great objects, we'll do that, which you also can't do in Alberta anymore. So objects are really these short statements of ultimate purpose. What do you ultimately exist to do? Do you exist to save cats? Do you exist to save cats but not dogs? Do you exist to look at housing? Do you exist to look at housing for a specific group of people or in a specific geographic area? They're this ultimate purpose, the ultimate difference you want to make, why you exist as an organization. Bylaws, on the other hand, are really about how. How will decisions be made? How will we decide who can be a member and who can't? Who cares about the objects of the organization and is impacted by them and therefore should have some decision-making in the organization. The bylaws are really high-level process, so it's like board roles, quorum, minimum attendance basically at meetings, standards for how your decisions can be made, like what's a majority vote, and your objects are really what difference you're trying to make.
I see. Actually, so this leads to a really great question that has been brought up before. So I'm going to use a fake example here. So I'll just read out the scenario and you can kind of give me your thoughts on it. So the Greenwood Housing Society, and again, that's not a real society in Alberta, they have a positive reputation for meeting its mandate to provide housing for low-income families in their town. Now, a funder has approached the society to inquire if the organization would also be willing to offer housing to women and children fleeing domestic violence, as there's no emergency shelter in the town. The funder can also provide a one-time capital grant for 15 additional units to be built and substantial ongoing program funding for shelter services. Now, this would mean a change to the overall objects, the overall purpose of the society. So how might the Greenwood Housing Society board evaluate this potential new funding and programming opportunity based on their external and internal rules? And could you go over what might the board's discussion look like through your explanation?
Sure. So the very first thing I would say the organization needs to do in this case is look at their objects, because their objects may or may not allow for it. So if their objects specifically say that they provide housing for low-income families in the town, and they limit it to low income, then I guess potentially you could help with people fleeing domestic violence, but only if they're low income. You can't offer programming that, well, I mean, so you can't offer programming that doesn't fit within the objects of your organization. Are you going to get caught out if you don't? There's no bylaw police, there's no object police, so maybe not. But you should not be offering any program that does not fit within the objects of your organization. The very first conversation then is, does this fit within our objects or not? If it doesn't, you either need to have a conversation about changing the purpose of the organization, or you don't have to have a conversation about anything. It doesn't fit, we're not even going to consider it, right? So that would be the first conversation. It's probably a decision about whether or not to open the objects or not. If let's say it fits within the objects of the organization and they don't need to change those objects, then your next step is to look at your vision and mission as an organization. So your vision is something that you can change at a board level. Most people take it to membership and get their backing for it. But it's usually approved and passed at board meetings. And it's a future state. I describe it as your idyllic future. What are you trying to achieve? How are you trying to make the world a better place? What positive difference are you trying to make? If offering housing for people fleeing domestic violence does not help you achieve your vision, then you probably should not be considering it. Much like objects, right? If it doesn't help you achieve that, you probably shouldn't be considering it. If it does help you achieve your vision and you say, yeah, this is work that would help us get to this ideal future we've described that we're trying to reach, your third step then is to look at your mission statement. Does this align with what we say in our mission statement we exist to do? If it doesn't align, you probably should be saying no to the funding and the opportunity. If it does align, then you start to get into your more maybe meaty questions about whether or not you have the governance and operational capacity to actually take on this expansion of programming and expansion of units. A one-time capital grant sounds great. Substantial ongoing program funding sounds really nice, but what does substantial mean, and what kind of programming? And what about utility costs? And what about internet costs? And what about repair costs if something happens to the home? Ongoing maintenance costs? What about all the other programming that is maybe needed? If there's fleeing domestic violence, there's some significant, at least mental health, but probably childcare and other programming that's needed. Do they have the people to do it? Do they have the policies and procedures to support the staff or the volunteers doing it? Do they have the ability to train and support those staff doing it? Will this program funding fund all of that, or are they going to need to find additional dollars? So there's some fairly significant operational questions that come after the, is this even something we should be considering?
Right.
As a total soapbox aside moment, I think most nonprofits here, we're willing to give you money and you can expand and think this sounds fantastic, let's do it. And I think the very first reaction should be, let's not be distracted by the shiny object. Let's stop and really think about this, because I would suggest that you are better to make a little difference in a really meaningful way than to try and make a really big difference but not get very far on it. So sometimes it's better to focus your efforts on something you're really, really good at and say no to the other opportunities than it is to keep looking for additional things to add on.
That's really great advice. So, and that's not to say that if an organization were to open up their objects and change or add to their existing objects so that they can both provide, in this case, offer housing to low-income people in society, but also offer housing to women and children fleeing domestic violence situations. That's not to say that they could have both, right? Like they can have both of those types of objects.
Yeah, totally. So their objects could be something to the effect of providing housing to people who are unable to find housing on their own, making sure that everyone in their community has a home to live in, ensuring, taking a housing first approach to services in their communities. If they had a really broad mandate like that, then yes, this would totally fit. And if it fit with their objects, it helped them achieve their vision and it aligned with what they said they were doing in their mission, then those could be really easy checkboxes that you get through in like 5, maybe 10 minutes, and you jump straight into the organizational capacity conversation about, yeah, but do we want to get into this? Can we get into this? Do we have the skills, the ability, the corporate functions to support this? If we don't, maybe we still want to do it, but then we have to have a real conversation about how do we build our organizational capacity in order to successfully expand into this.
Right. Or perhaps creating a sister organization to tackle that specific avenue as well.
Yeah, and so it could be that there's another organization that would be better at it. It could be that if you entered into partnership or some kind of shared services and collaborative agreement with another organization, you could jointly offer it. It could be that if you found a way to hand off some of the things that you're not really great at, but you're spending a lot of time on, it would free up the internal capacity to take on this grant and to take on this programming. So there's a lot of options and a lot of things to consider.
Yeah, but all the while,
if it aligns with your objects, helps
right.
you achieve your vision and aligns with your mission. And if it doesn't, you've had a robust conversation and really considered the implications of making the necessary adjustments to all or any of those things in order to have this fit.
Thank you. And that's what I was going to say as well, that all those discussions happen within that framework of their legal landscape, of their objects, of their bylaws, policies, procedures, as well as the legislation and regulations that they have to follow as well.
Exactly. I mean, you're probably not going to a whole lot of external rules around should we or should we not accept this funding. I'm going to assume it's coming from a legitimate place, and it's not like a, whoa, like who are you that you have money like this? But like a legitimate funding organization or a government or something. And so you're not really looking at many of the external rules at that point when you're making a decision about whether to pursue this or not, right? Those are really your internal rules that you're looking at abiding by or changing to allow you to pursue this. You're very much going to be interested in external rules, though, when you start to, if you accept the money. So what's the contract? What needs to be in the contract? What do we want to ensure is in the contract? What can't be in the contract? There's building code rules you have to follow. There's probably privacy rules you have to follow. There's probably standards with regards to social work or psychology or childcare or something around running the programs that you would have to follow. If you're employing more people, there's employment rules you're going to have to follow. If you're employing volunteers, there's going to be training stuff, best practices that you maybe want to follow. So it's when you accept the money and start to pursue it that you're probably really looking at external rules. But until then, it's a lot of internal rules. I'm saying that, and then I'm thinking, if you accept the money and this is a real expansion on programming, there's probably internal rules you either have to change or add to allow for this. So even if your objects allow for it, if it fits with your vision and mission, and if you determine we totally have the organizational capacity and the organizational will to take this on, you're probably still looking at, okay, so what are the associated risks? Who else are we bringing on? What additional programming is there? What are the staffing requirements for this? And what policies and procedures do we need to put in place now so that we have some rules for people to follow when they are doing this, so that if we ever do run into a challenging situation, we have something written down somewhere to follow, right?
Right. Okay, well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. Before we end, though, I just want to give you one last chance, and I'm putting you on the spot here. If there's one piece of wisdom that you have to share, that you would like to share with nonprofits in regards to kind of navigating this legal landscape, what would it be?
Oh, goodness. One piece of wisdom. Well, the term wisdom makes me really nervous. I don't know that I'm all that wise about any of this stuff. But maybe the one thing I would say about internal and external legal landscape is actually about your internal legal landscape. Most, maybe not most, but a very, very, very many nonprofits very, very rarely look at their objects or their bylaws. They don't really worry about their policy and procedure manual, especially if they're smaller organizations. The thing is, because a lot of people look at it as paperwork, right? And they don't really want to worry about it. And they're more interested in the vision and mission of the organization, right? They want to offer the programming. They want to, you know, engage the volunteers. They don't want to worry about the paperwork and the governance and that kind of thing. Thing is, I think we forget that actually our objects and bylaws, policies and procedures can be really helpful tools to save you a lot of work, right? To save you a lot of decisions, to save you a lot of meetings, to save you a lot of paperwork in the future. That if you can get yourselves organized and get things documented and then actually use those things, it should actually make your life easier.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Jen. And thank you for taking the time again for speaking with me. I know that you're very busy. And until next time, we will see you on the other side. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.